do you think that this more masculine perspective of modern world, and that maybe we saw very clearly in the 20th century, may reflect the failure of political structures such as communism and things like that, that try to help in a utopical way, individuality to go to communion, but was it from the same structure of individuality? Was it too masculine to achieve it?
Well, yes, and I think what happens here is that we have to bring in another dimension, namely the vertical dimension of growth and development and genealogy. And that's the general stages that I've been talking about, is archaic, magic, mythic, membership, mythic, conformist, and then rational, rational egoic, individualistic, and then green, pluralistic, postmodern, and also has an emphasis on communal organization. And part of what Marxism did was attempted to introduce this pluralistic, communal way of living. But since each of those stages of consciousness tend to go with a particular techno-economic mode of production, so that archaic, magic, mythic, rational, and pluralistic correspond to foraging, horticultural, agrarian, industrial, and informational. And the difficulty was that some of these communal modes of knowing, coming from the pluralistic stage and supported by an informational infrastructure, which really was not present at the time that Karl Marx conceived of a communalistic way of living, the ideas were introduced into societies that were at an agricultural, an agrarian stage of techno-economic behavior. And that has a mythic, membership, fundamentalistic orientation. And so there was a great problem in that the ideas were about 2 stages ahead of where the techno-economic base could support it. So again, it's not just looking at masculine and feminine approaches. There was an attempt here to rebalance masculine and feminine, but not using modern and postmodern techno-economic bases, but rather very primitive agrarian structures. And so it was really rather doomed to fail for those reasons alone. And it was turned into, Marxism became a fundamentalistic religion and was believed in as an absolutistic mode of knowing. And those are all variations on the mythic stage of development. The mythic, dogmatic, fundamentalistic approach to reality was called absolutistic by Claire Graves. And Marxism became an absolutistic system. It was believed that it had absolute certainty, that it had a scientific approach to the stages of human development, economic development, and that it had the key to the next form of revolution or transformation. And all of those had some type of validity according to the pluralistic stage. But the countries and the nations that it was introduced in were not at the pluralistic stage at all, but were at the fundamentalistic stage. And so Marxism became philosophically an absolutistic system, no different than if somebody is fundamentalist Christian or fundamentalist Muslim, and is believed in with that kind of absolute certainty. And that's one of the main reasons that Marxism essentially failed. The whole postmodern attack on previous forms of thinking certainly included an attack on Marxism. And that was in part the reason for it.
Ken, if we look back to what you just mentioned about Marxism and other clashes of freedom and equality, do you believe we can go from individuality to community with consciousness of our own individuality?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer involves primarily having the leading edge right now in Western thought, whether it's political thought or sociological thought or philosophical thinking, is essentially the pluralistic postmodern edge. And that is a stage of development that also becomes very relativistic. And so it denies universals and denies common patterns and focuses basically on each individual and each individual culture having its own truths. So that makes it very, very hard to come up with any kind of commonality across people and across cultures. So at the same time, there's an extreme emphasis on the collective. The social structure actually creates reality, so that so-called social construction of all knowledge. And for integral thinking, that's another kind of absolutism. We call it a quadrant absolutism. And so that's what can happen once a structure has emerged, is that cultures can simply shift quite dramatically, depending on artifacts that are put into it and depending on the actual structures of power and what modes of discourse they use. The individuals still have to go through those stages. And that's one of the real problems, is that just as earlier we talked about Marxism was an attempt to take pluralistic ideals and graft them onto traditional agrarian cultures, and that categorically doesn't work. And we see the same kind of thing happening today is in the growth of non-Western cultures, because the Western influence is still so intense, the whole globalization issue, that the growth of these other cultures are subjected to a lot of very unfortunate stresses. And so their development is something that you have to track very carefully using quadrants and levels and lines and states and types. But will they go through development in this, linear, archaic dominant mode of discourse to magic dominant mode to mythic to rational? No, they won't. Not necessarily. But the individuals in those societies are going through those stages.
But then should they have the West as a model or not?
No, I probably not in terms of all ways of development. And again, it's not an either or, it's kind of a both and. There are things about globalization that's very positive, and there are things about it that are very negative. And the things about it that are positive is that to the extent that it lives up to the actual modern scientific level of development, then it introduces universal rights of humans. And so there's an insistence, for example, on educating girls in third world countries. And there's an insistence on working for an equality of men and women. And then the downside, of course, is that there's a whole corporate structure that gets carried with globalization. And corporate structures, unfortunately, is that they're artifacts. And an artifact can have any level of moral development driving it. And if the moral level of development of the modern stage is very high, it's a world-centric morality, the universal rights of humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. But the artifacts created by modernity, from machine guns to gas ovens, can be used by pre-modern individuals, by individuals at narcissistic power and ethnocentric modes. And anybody can pick up a machine gun. And that's the problem. Modernity gets blamed for a lot of things that are actually modern artifacts with pre-modern moral structures driving them. Nazis were ethnocentric. They were not modern. They were ethnocentric in their core of being, but they adopted modern technology and modern artifacts as part of their ends. And that's one of the real problems that we have. And the same thing can happen with business, is that it's, in essence, a product of modernity, the artifact of business, the structures of it, the systems, the creation of profit drives. But many people inhabit business not from the moral level of modernity, which would be very moral. And there are a lot of very moral people in business. But there are a lot of very immoral people in business. And looking just for profits, just for the bottom line, not including interiors, not including care, not including concern and consciousness and love for that matter, but running at a very power-driven level, a red altitude, as we say, and that red altitude, that drive for power, that egocentric drive, inhabits too much of corporate life. And that corporate life inhabits too much of globalism. So that's why it gets a little bit complex, but you can analyze it using an integral framework and track what's actually happening, because you can see these elements better using an integral framework. And so the West is not a model in all ways. And so I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. Part of the things that are worth modeling are aspects of the Constitution guaranteeing human rights, and in aspects of the articles added to the Constitution guaranteeing community rights. So there's sort of a little balance of agency and communion. But the actual corporate structure and the way the profit motive is structured, I don't think that's necessarily worth modeling. And third world cultures, of course, are just going to be subjected to an enormous amount of power structures simply from the G8, simply from those industrial nations that have power now and are not going to freely relinquish it. So it's just a kind of an unfortunate situation that's developing, and the modes of resistance to it are limited, and that's unfortunate.